Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode 34, Wednesday, February 19th, 2020.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your co-host, Courtney, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Emily.
Hey, Courtney. I'm so happy to be back here on the show with you and have another special guest.
Yep, today we are joined for another interview. Christopher E. Smith is the author of several books about Walt Disney World, including 2 volumes of the backstories and magical secrets of Walt Disney World. And our focus today, the Walt Disney World that never was, stories behind the amazing Imagineering dreams that never came true. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Chris, we're so excited to have you. And before we get into your book, we would like to learn a little bit more about you. So can you share with us and our listeners a little bit about yourself and your Disney fandom?
Sure. So I'm a corporate attorney by day, and I practice in Huntsville, Alabama, which for people who don't know is in the northern part of the state. My family and I actually live in a smaller town called Mooresville that has a little Disney connection in of itself, but I've been a Disney fan since I was a kid, and I'm sure, like you, kind of my passion, it's not recent. It's going on since I was a child, and I took my first trip to Walt Disney World when I was 7 years old, and that just kind of just started a passion that I'm sure my wife wishes at some points had never started, because it has resulted in many, many trips and obviously now writing books. But for me, and I've talked to a lot of people who feel this way as well, is Walt Disney World is. It really is a magical place. It's more than just attractions and buildings and restaurants. It's a place where I think dreams really can come true. And if you don't believe that, then just grab a bench on Main Street, USA, and watch the faces of kids when they walk through the turnstiles.
Definitely a good place for people watching. But I do have to ask, since you're from Alabama, are you Roll Tide or War Eagle?
I am Roll Tide, but I made the cardinal mistake of any University of Alabama fan, which is to fall in love with an Auburn girl. And
no! You guys are divided.
We are. She's an Auburn grad, and then we have 3 children, and we've done the adult thing, which is divide the children up. So my 2 daughters are Auburn fans, and my son Samuel is following in my footsteps.
Oh, very nice. I was always curious. I know it's a big rivalry. But back to Disney. I really love this topic that we're talking about today, and I feel like there's often a lot of buzz about extinct or defunct attractions. There's several YouTube series along those lines now. But how did unbuilt attractions catch your interest and lead to this book project?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like you mentioned, I've written several books, and, all of them, thankfully, have received, just extremely positive feedback from everyone. But, those topics that some of those other books cover, some Disney fans are interested in Disney details and fun secrets, and some aren't. Right. But the concept of what could have been at Walt Disney World, every Disney fan I talk to is really fascinated by that topic. Right. It's something that really gets a really good positive reaction from everyone, and everybody's curious about it. For me, the way it started was, again, I've been a fan of Disney generally, and the Walt Disney World parks specifically for a long time. And, I started kind of, as I'm a history major as well. So just started conducting as much research as I could to learn more about the parks. And, I got my hands on some old annual reports of the Disney company. And what those essentially are disclosure documents that the company puts out to its shareholders that kind of talks about everything the company has going on and kind of looks forward to what it's planning to do in the next year. And Disney's a public company, so you can, go online and find those recent reports now. And, they're very sterile and much more corporate now. But what I discovered in some of those older reports from the 1960s and the 1970s and even into the 80s is, I would read about these really cool attractions and concepts that I knew had never actually been implemented into the parks. Whether it's a Thunder Mesa concept or all of these really cool resorts that were originally planned to be around the Seven Seas Lagoon, and that just really, that really sparked my interest. And I started doing a little more digging and investigating, and I found all of these other stories that were out there that that were really just cool to find out about. But as I started digging, I found out that the story behind, why some of these attractions and lands and restaurants were never built really told the story of the Disney company. It was much more to it than, hey, this was a cool attraction that didn't get built. It was, what was the Disney company dealing with in terms of financial stress or, external economic pressures or, even Walt Disney's death. All of those things played into these concepts. And so I was really amazed that there wasn't a book out there already that kind of did a deep dive on a lot of these concepts. And so, sparked with that inspiration, I started taking the steps towards putting the book together.
Well, we're glad you did, because you're right. I've heard sprinklings here and there about some of these different unbuilt attractions or resorts, but never, you're right, like all in one place or thoroughly researched. But before we get into your research, I wanted to ask a question more about your background. How does your work as an attorney, how did that influence your writing and how you approach this project?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good question. And, I think that my background there helped me tremendously in terms of the research aspect of the book, right? So, research is a big part of what I think every attorney does. And so that helped me when I was in that process. But writing as an attorney, and especially writing as a corporate attorney for me, so I work on, contracts and corporate documents and things of that nature. That's a very different writing style than trying to, tell a story and to make it entertaining. So I think it helped me on the research side, but on the actual writing side, I kind of had to really rethink things and go about it a different way. I probably did it more systematic and more kind of an outline regimen like I would a contract. But thankfully, the end result, I think, was much more story driven. But again, it was the background did come in handy.
We are very big outliners, so we understand. I feel like my approach would be very similar. But you've done all this research and, you've started to write it. And you're certainly not the first author that we've had from Theme Park Press, but every author we found really has a unique publishing experience. Could you share a little more about yours, like finding an editor, the cover art, all that process?
Yes. And so, it's so funny now to look back because things, kind of your mindset is so much different that first time around than it is now, right? And Bob McLean at Theme Park Press is one of my very close friends now. At the time, I had no idea who he was, and I'm very thankful, that Bob is out there and his press is out there that's devoted to Disney books primarily, and certainly a lot of the people you've had on are authors for him. But so I had this idea, and I was convinced that, man, this idea is really good, right? I mean, I think this is something, it's a topic that I would want to read about as a Disney fan. So surely there are other people who would. So I just reached out, just a blind email to Bob, and that started, this correspondence. And, at the time, all I had was an idea, right? A lot of people kind of take the extra step of, hey, let's, start the writing process. But all I had was a concept. And Bob's question to me was, well, how far along are you? And I said, well, I put it in the email that you've already read. And he said, well, I tell you what, it sounds like a good idea. Why don't you get to writing and see what you can do? And I did that. And, I have so much more respect now for writers than I did before I started the first book, because it really is. It is both a lot of fun, but good grief, sitting down in front of a laptop with that cursor blinking, it can be tough too, right? It can be really difficult to kind of formulate what you're trying to say. But I did that. Probably spent way too much time working on that first book. It was a good, 2-year at least project for me because I really was passionate about it, and I really wanted it to be as good as it possibly could be. And then got it to a point where, for me as an attorney, letting go that first draft was very difficult. Because, every time I read any type of document, whether it's a book that I've written or a corporate project I'm working on at the office, if I read something, I'm going to change it and I'm going to revise it and I'm going to try to make it better. And Bob told me, he said, listen, no book is perfect. The goal is to get it 99% there and then let me step in as an editor and help you get it across the finish line. So I finally did let it go, sent it to Bob, and Bob and I went through a couple of rounds of revisions, and finally got ready to kind of get it out to press. The book cover was something that I was completely lost on, right? I mean, I'm the most unartistic person you will ever find, but I was like, this is a special book and a special concept. I think it needs a special cover to go along with that. And so Bob has different artists he used, and he connected me with a gentleman named Dan Cunningham, who, we kind of went back and forth on different colors and designs, but came up with a cover that I just absolutely loved, that provided little windows for each park and drawings about, that kind of symbolize some of these never was concepts. And, and then finally, the book was released, and I was really just blown away by the reception. It's really a leap of faith when you kind of, pour your hard work into something, and you think it's good, but you don't know what other people might think. And just the overwhelmingly positive response that it has gotten, and it's really kind of taken on a life of its own. I never would have thought, that this project that I worked on at night for a couple of years would have as much success as it has. But very thankful for that. And now, as I'm, I've gone through more books, I think my process has gotten a lot more streamlined. I think the back and forth that Bob and I have from a creative standpoint is much more efficient. But Bob had to be very patient with me that first time around, specifically just because, having an attorney marking up, your drafts and that can be a frustrating process. So I'm sure he was probably sick of me by the time we finally got it to press.
Thanks so much for sharing the background of that. And I have to say, I'm glad that others have enjoyed it as much as I have. I think you have the distinction thus far of being one of maybe 2 books that I read before we even started this podcast. So I had found your book and read it, I think back in 2017 or so. I bought it for my dad, and I was like, okay, but I actually want to read this too.
Well, one of the coolest things for me, and this has happened a couple of times, is, I get down, I'm in North Alabama, so I get down to Walt Disney World very often, both for fun with my family and, quote unquote research projects, for books, which is really just an excuse to get down there again. And I've been on a couple of buses before where people have started talking about the book, and that's just so cool to me that there's people out there, Disney fans like me, who, like I said, I wrote a book that I would want to read, and it's great. It's just been just so fun to see that reaction and other people enjoy it as well.
Did you turn around and say, "Hey, that's me. I wrote that," when you hear people talk about it?
The first time I couldn't help myself, right? I had to. The second time I didn't. I just kind of smiled and hope nobody was going to jump into the conversation and say, "Man, that book was terrible. I don't know what y'all are talking about."
Well, it definitely wasn't terrible. This is my first time reading it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so let's talk about the book. Kind of starting with a big picture question from all of your research after writing this book. Can you just summarize for us and our readers what you think is the most common reason Disney attractions do not get built?
Yeah, and it is, just as a preface to this answer, a lot of people, including me, view Walt Disney World as this perfect place, right? This place of innocence and fun and joy, and it absolutely is all of those things. But a lot of people don't realize or don't want to realize that behind that park is an actual company that has shareholders that it has to report to, and at the end of the day, they have to make money. They have to make a profit. With that background, the primary reason that these concepts never came to be are costs and construction constraints and budgetary reasons. One of the misconceptions I had when I started, doing the initial research was I thought, if an attraction or a land was never built, well, then it must not have been very good, right? I mean, otherwise they would have done it. Well, the reality is the opposite was really true. These concepts and these ideas were so grand, and in some cases pushed the bounds of technology at the time and were so large in scope that they came with them, a very large price tag. And anytime you're dealing with construction projects, including either building parks or adding to parks, you're always going to have cost overruns. And so the company has to make physical decisions about what it can do and what it can't do. And unfortunately, for a lot of these concepts, they found themselves on the cutting board for cost reasons. Now, there are certainly other reasons, specific things that have happened on some of these, but by and large, it's just too much cost and too much expense for the company to put into a project.
I think one of those that falls into the other category sometimes is World Showcase, and it was interesting to learn about things that had been fully announced. I know I had heard of the Soviet Union and Israel before, but not Denmark, and Emily hadn't heard of Spain. So we're curious, which country's absence surprised you the most?
World Showcase really is, I don't know about you, but World Showcase is one of my favorite places to spend time at Walt Disney World. I mean, it just such a cool area. And before I started, this shows you, before I started research for the book, I couldn't count the number of times that I've walked around World Showcase. And I've dined in every country, and I've visited, but until I started doing research, I had never noticed how much available land was there in World Showcase between the pavilions, right? I thought that one national pavilion would end and another one would start, when the reality is between most of those, you have these large plats of land where new countries could be added. Just from a historical standpoint, the one that I think the Disney company was convinced was going to happen was Equatorial Africa, on opening day of Epcot in 1982. They had tons of signage up and tons of concept art, and even kind of, in the television previews for the park, talking and advertising this pavilion that would come, a year later. And what was interesting about the Equatorial Africa Pavilion was it was going to be the first pavilion that wasn't dedicated to kind of one country, but a wide breadth. These different countries across the equatorial belt in Africa. So the Congo and Uganda, and the pavilion would have been beautiful. I mean, upwards of 4 attractions, this large 60-foot treehouse that would have anchored the pavilion, and then for a lot of reasons, including political reasons, it just never came to be. Now, you mentioned the Soviet Union Pavilion. I think that's personally my favorite, World Showcase pavilion that was never built to think about, because we do have some concept art that's out there that shows what it would have been. And it would have just been, I think, absolutely beautiful. This large, replica of Red Square, St. Basil's Cathedral, complete with those onion domes, a large kind of brick courtyard. I think it would have been fantastic. Now, as you all know from the book, what really was the death knell of that project is that the Soviet Union fell in the 1990s, in the early 90s. And so with that, that project kind of went away too. But I'm always anxious and hopeful that at some point a new pavilion will be added. If you would have asked me, 5 years ago, will we get a new World Showcase National Pavilion, I would have probably said no. But now I think that's changing somewhat. I do think, just because this is how I'm actually working on a new project where I'll talk about, the hot topic of Disney's use of intellectual properties. But I do think it'll take an intellectual property tie to a nation, a film that is set in a certain country for that to happen. But I am more optimistic that it will happen now than I was a few years ago.
That's really cool. We'd love to hear a little bit more about that project towards the end. But I had a comment about the Soviet Union, because even though I've heard of that one before, that country still surprised me that even during the Cold War, we would want to build a Soviet Union pavilion. Just your personal opinion, why do you think Disney would want to do that? Do you think it was like an olive branch? Do you think people had interest?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and it's just really a difficult question to answer because, it's the same thing. I put this in the same category of, an Israel pavilion that was contemplated for, was advertised at opening day, right? I think that in terms of the offerings, the architecture and a particular attraction and just the aesthetic for both of those concepts would have looked great. You have to think there would have been, today there certainly would be some type of protests, going on, in front of those pavilions, which Disney wouldn't want. But they were convinced that the Soviet Union pavilion was going to happen, right? And I'm convinced that if the Soviet Union had not crumbled, that it would have happened. Now, whether they were doing that as an olive branch or as a way to, they were convinced they could manage whatever, collateral issues that would come up by virtue of that pavilion. It's really fascinating to think about.
I think you make a good point there in regards to, seeing how those things played out. It might not have been the best choice, but is there an unbuilt attraction that you think is the most feasible now, maybe aside from a World Showcase pavilion?
Do you mean in terms of an attraction for World Showcase?
No, any of the things that you discussed in the book.
Oh, absolutely. So, and I'll answer it, then I'll give you kind of the story behind it. And I would say Villains Mountain. And as you may or may not know, Disney villains are extremely popular. I mean, the merchandise flies off the shelves. When the parks have special events that feature the villains, they're always sold out. And so, one of my favorite attractions when I first visited the park in 1984 was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Absolutely loved that attraction. It took up a massive footprint in Fantasyland and was kind of a maintenance nightmare. And so the attraction, closed temporarily in the early 90s, and it became a permanent closure. And the land just kind of sat there pretty much vacant for a long time. And so when Michael Eisner comes in, he wants to add some more teen and adult-based attractions to the park. And one of those was called Villains Mountain. And it would have been, the architecture would have been, inspired by the Night on Bald Mountain portion of the 1940 film Fantasia, and would have featured all the Disney villains, right? And so just kind of a Disney villain lover's dream come true. The reason that it wasn't incorporated at the time was Disney, at least in part, contemplated larger plans for villains, either a separate park land for villains, or even, there were always rumors and thoughts of a standalone theme park. And so they didn't want to use this e-ticket type idea for the Magic Kingdom and Fantasyland if they were going to need it for one of these larger expansions. And as we know, it just never came to be. But, again, that Disney villain popularity has not changed from then to now. And I think something like that, and a villains-based attraction, especially something like that would have been, again, kind of an e-ticket category attraction, I think it would be immensely popular now with guests.
Absolutely. And moving like the Halloween party to that
Yes.
park. Although I don't know if I could see Magic Kingdom without some sort of Halloween party. Maybe there could be two.
I can't get enough Halloween, so maybe everybody else feels the same way. But
I know Courtney does.
what's when we think about these concepts, though, a lot of them, looking back in retrospect, you kind of think, what were they thinking? Just because times change and perspectives change. But I do think that Villains Mountain concept is one of those that would still be applicable today.
And I think you're right that there's a new movement of people loving the villains. They always have, but I think we see it more also in merchandise, that they've almost taken on a franchise like the Disney princesses. They're like their own eclectic group. And now there's the after hours party that's villain themed. Courtney, you just went to that
I did.
last week.
Yep. I went on Valentine's Day, so it was like Valentine's Day.
Very fun. So I think you're right that I think that would be very feasible. But one attraction that Courtney and I would love, going a little bit more down the quote rabbit hole, we are big fans. See, Courtney, I'm working on my puns here. We're big fans of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. We've talked about it on this show before, how much we want Roger Rabbit to have a resurgence in the parks. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about writing that Roger Rabbit chapter, as well as what do you think about Toontown not being in Disney Hollywood Studios, but making it to Disneyland?
Yeah, so I get asked the question a lot. What's my personal favorite concept that never came to be? And admittedly, that changes, from day to day. But most of the time, my response is Roger Rabbit's Hollywood, because I think it would have been an incredibly themed area that would have tied in perfectly with the host park. And people forget. I mean, you two know, but I have to remind people just how overwhelmingly popular the Who Framed Roger Rabbit film was in 1988. I mean, it was, it was a cultural phenomenon. And, a lot of people, even, the Disney company, when you talk about the Disney animation renaissance that kind of pulled, Disney animation out from that lull that it had for many years, they point to 1989 and The Little Mermaid. And certainly, that film's included. And then, The Lion King and Aladdin and Beauty and the Beast and all those. But I would say that renaissance actually began with Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was the first film since Mary Poppins in 1964 that featured animation to win multiple Academy Awards. And it was the second highest grossing film of the year behind Rain Man, with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. So just an overwhelmingly popular film. And so, what really kind of, the reason that, and I'll talk about more what this area would have included in a second, but the reason that it didn't get implemented is that, because Disney was struggling film-wise at the time, Michael Eisner decided to partner with Steven Spielberg and his company Amblin Entertainment to, share the expenses and the risk on the film. But at the same time, they also granted him, he had to approve theme park attractions and other uses of intellectual property. Well, the film's an overwhelming success. It's set within the same general time period of Disney's Hollywood Studios, so that 1930s, 1940s golden era of Hollywood. And so, when you look at the Disney Studios at the time, Disney MGM Studios opening in 1989, it had very limited offerings. It was really considered a half-day park. It had a real working studio at the time. And so Disney immediately looked at ideas for expanding. And one of these ideas was to add a section, at the end of, add a Sunset Boulevard, and at the end of Sunset Boulevard have this area called Roger Rabbit's Hollywood that would have included, and it breaks my heart to say this, it would have included 3 different attractions, right? So a Baby Herman's Baby Buggy ride, dark ride, a Benny the Cab ride, a Toontown trolley simulator type attraction that, in my opinion, again, I don't know that there would be a more perfect fit for any IP in any park than there would have been for Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Disney's studios. Now, where the dispute came in with Disney and Spielberg was, and this is really just fascinating to me, there was never a sequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but there were a series of shorts, cartoon shorts. One of those was aired before Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and was credited with kind of boosting the revenue for that film. And so with the second Disney short, believe it or not, Spielberg wanted to air that in front of a film called Arachnophobia, which was, a spider thriller horror type film. And Disney wanted to air it in front of Dick Tracy, which at the time Disney viewed that as its next huge blockbuster franchise. And because of that disagreement, they just could never, come to an agreement. Now, again, I hope, and each time I go through the parks, when I see those hidden Roger Rabbit tributes, whether it's the Maroon Studios billboard or the Roger Rabbit cutout in the window above the Hollywood and Dime Theater, I just think, why can't we make this happen now? Why can't we get something here? And I think, thematically, in terms of fit, in terms of Disneyland versus the studios, I don't think there's any comparison. I think clearly, in my mind, Disney's Hollywood Studios should be the home of Roger Rabbit. And for some reason, it just hasn't happened. But if you look back to a lot of the early studios, marketing materials and advertisements, Roger Rabbit is all over that stuff. I mean, dare I say, he was as big, if not bigger, than Mickey Mouse at the time. And I think Eisner viewed Roger Rabbit as being the Mickey Mouse for Disney Studios. The annual report from that year really reads like a love letter to Roger Rabbit. I mean, it was amazing how strong that was. In my opinion, and again, this is just based on nothing but just kind of me looking at the situation, I think that Disney would have pushed that legal battle much harder to try to get those concepts based on Roger Rabbit into the parks much harder had they not had the success of The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and those successive blockbuster hits after hits. Because at that point, they've got intellectual property characters that they can use without a fight. So, why don't they, avoid that and just use what they know they can? But it's really a shame because I think that would have been just absolutely perfect for the studios.
I agree, because I think about the movie and when we see Toontown over that brick wall and how you have the juxtaposition of the quote reality Hollywood, and they're just right over there. They could have so recreated that right from the film.
Yeah, it is. And again, you remember the film, but it was, it was so popular. It was absolutely so popular. And if you wouldn't have had this disagreement, I think you would have gotten multiple sequels, not short films, but actual films. And that would have just further, driven the theme park additions as well. But my goodness, it's definitely one that, it's very unique in its story because of all these different things that happened to create the issue as to why it was never, Roger Rabbit's Hollywood never came to be. But I'm never going to give up. My hope is that somehow, some way, we will get more Roger Rabbit into the studios at some point.
I just checked, and Roger Rabbit is on Disney Plus. So if you're listening to this and you have children, it's up to you to show them that film, and we can create a new generation of Roger Rabbit fans. But sticking with the studios, there's another IP that I would love to touch on. Emily and I are both alumni of the University of Maryland, and there's another famous alumnus, and that is Jim Henson, and of course the Muppets. We do have Muppet Vision 3D, which is one of the last things that Jim worked on, but I think that's another unique scenario where, it's pretty much because Jim passed away that maybe we didn't get to see so much there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Muppets in the studios as well.
You're right. I mean, that certainly Roger Rabbit's Hollywood, and now this Muppet Studios concept, Jim Henson, they definitely have their unique story as to why they never came to be in the form that they could have been. And Jim Henson was just like many of the people at Disney, was just a brilliant creative person, and obviously focused on, good family friendly type entertainment, whether it be the Muppets or, Fraggle Rock, if you remember that show, or Sesame Street, this master puppeteer. Well, in the 90s, in the late 80s and kind of, getting into 1990, Henson and Disney were working hand in hand on many creative projects. And one of those projects was going to be this new land for the studios. Again, this all goes back to kind of the massive popularity of the park when it opened and the limited offerings that the park actually had. And so this is, again, one of those different expansion plans that were contemplated. And so you would have had, Muppet Vision 3D, which we did in fact get. You would have had a Muppet themed restaurant, which we also kind of got later. But the star of Muppet Studios would have been, the Great Muppet Movie Ride. And I've got a soft spot in my heart for this attraction because, again, based on the concept art that we see, it would have been great. I mean, I'm sure everyone remembers the Great Movie Ride, which was the signature attraction for the studios for many years, where you were taken through these different scenes and dioramas of famous films. Well, the Muppet version would have just been a parody of those films. And so, we have some concept art of, the classic monster film Frankenstein, but you've got, Dr. Bunsen Honeydew in the place of Dr. Frankenstein, and Beaker as Frankenstein's monster. And you've got another piece of concept art that shows, the Peter Pan scene with Miss Piggy as Tinkerbell and Kermit as Peter Pan, and just all kinds of silly hijinks, going on. Just would have been a very fun, very cool attraction, and I think a very fun area of the park. Now, Henson and Disney were actively negotiating a sale of Henson's company to Disney, and the relationship was so good. I think they were literally on the doorstep of closing that deal. As a matter of fact, I can't remember the exact year, but there's an annual report of the Disney company where they essentially announced that the parties have, agreed in principle to a sale. Well, as a corporate attorney, I, more than most, understand the difference between agreeing to a deal in principle and actually closing that deal, right? And unfortunately, Henson tragically passed away before that deal could be closed. And what you had was, there's lots of rumors and lots of, questions as to, why that deal couldn't be worked out with his estate later, but it just wasn't. And so instead of being able to buy the rights to build these attractions, Disney had to license the right. And so, instead of getting this entire Muppet themed land, you instead got just the Muppet Vision 3D attraction. Now, Disney did many years later, I think in 2005, did finally purchase the rights, by essentially, Henson's company, and the rights to Henson's characters. But my goodness, isn't it amazing to think that literally this deal was on the doorstep of happening, and which would have resulted in, these additions. And, again, Henson tragically passed before, the documents could be 100% finalized and signed. And because of that, things completely changed.
I would have loved if we got more Muppets. I'm happy we're starting to see Muppets pop up more around the parks. We still have great moments in American history for a little bit longer.
Seasonally.
Seasonally. And for instance, the new restaurant in Epcot opened this week. Sam Eagle's
Regal Eagle
Salute.
Barbecue.
Salute
Yes.
to all cookouts, but mostly barbecue. I forget the tagline. So I'm glad to see that Muppets are making a resurgence and that people are really excited about them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, when the Star Wars and the Toy Story expansion plans were announced, I'm sure you all remember this. I mean, people were, the thought was, well, there goes Muppet Vision 3D, right? So, you thought with these kind of heavier at the time intellectual property franchises, that's going to be the end of the Muppets. But, instead, Disney kind of doubled down and not only kept, Muppet Vision, you got these other, experiences that featured Muppet characters, which I love.
So moving forward, going back to a larger big picture question, were there any unmade attractions that were left out of this book?
Yes, there were, and I'll say one was the one that I really wanted to write about was a restaurant that would have been located in Tomorrowland that would have been kind of back when Tomorrowland was rethemed to New Tomorrowland, the future that never will be. This Buck Rogers, Jules Verne type restaurant with these different philosophers included. And then some other attraction concepts like that. And it was really difficult to leave those out. But the reason I did was I just could not. It was important to me that if I was going to write about something, that I at least had some tangible information to rely upon. Right. And so I'd seen stories and different ideas and places, but I just couldn't find enough concrete information about those experiences to really, feel comfortable putting them in the book. Now, I will tell you this, you may ask me about this later, but, I'm not, since finishing the first book, the Walt Disney World That Never Was, I have not been able to just focus on one particular project, right? So now I've always got 3 or 4 different books going at the same time, and I'll just work on one at a time. And I will be getting to a project that looks at, projects that never came to be for other Disney parks. Salute to all other Disney parks, but mostly Disneyland. Because there are a lot of good concepts out there that I will hit. For Walt Disney World, again, there were other things out there considered and thought of, but I just could not find enough information that I felt comfortable with actually, publishing and discussing in the book.
That makes sense. One thing that we haven't really touched on, though, is you also talk about resorts in addition to the attractions. So we'd love to know, which of those unbuilt resorts would you have loved to stay in the most?
Oh, I'll tell you, it's a 3-way tie.
Uh-oh.
And they were all considered for the same time period. So it was these 3 additional resorts that were planned for opening day. And it was the Asian, the Venetian, and the Persian. And, originally, Disney thought that, the Seven Seas Lagoon would have 5 resorts. It would have the Contemporary and the Polynesian, which we did get. At the time, the Grand Floridian wasn't on the drawing board. But then these other, highly themed resorts. And what's amazing is they marketed these things very heavily, right? If you go back to late 1960, early 1970, the marketing materials and preview guides and all these different advertisements that Disney put out, you see these resorts, the Asian, the Venetian, and the Persian, plastered all over them, right? And so, the Asian would have been in the spot where the Grand Floridian did end up being constructed, and it would have been, a very Thai influenced and themed resort with, this large A-frame building in the center that would have included a restaurant near the top, would have looked out over the lagoon and towards the Magic Kingdom, which I think would have been great. What may have been, the most beautiful and the most romantic resort in Disney would have been the Venetian, right? This Italian themed resort that would have been in an area between the Contemporary and the Ticket and Transportation Center. So it's an area that's kind of just this wooded area now. But what I think is so cool about that is it would have included a series of canals within the resort, right? So you felt like you were in Venice and could travel by boat through these different areas within the resort, which I think is just very cool. And then finally, this Persian resort that would have actually been located adjacent to the outskirts of Tomorrowland, kind of north of the Contemporary, kind of close to where the new Tron attraction is being constructed, and it would have had a heavy Middle Eastern influence, just gorgeous artistic renderings of buildings with these beautiful blue domes and awash and white colors. And what really fascinates me most about the Persian in particular is there are a couple of different pieces of concept art that shows how that resort would have gotten monorail access. Okay, so all of these would have included, just like you have today with the Seven Seas Lagoon Resorts, would have had monorail access. One has just kind of a spur of the monorail running up to the Persian and back, but another actually includes, I think this would have been so cool, it actually runs through Tomorrowland, right? So from the Persian and then through Tomorrowland, and then back outside the park, which I think would have been really cool. Now, obviously, none of those ever came to be, and primarily that was because, I don't know if you all remember, but the OPEC oil embargo in the early 1970s, and just kind of the huge global economic negative economic impact that had. People just stopped traveling as much as they had been before, and Disney, became concerned about kind of what their visitor numbers were looking like, and they never made it. But man, just to imagine those three resorts sitting there on the Seven Seas Lagoon, it would have completely changed the landscape of obviously the Magic Kingdom resort area, but I think really changed the landscape of Walt Disney World as a whole.
That was one of those really interesting moments, like you said, that's one of the few categories of not having enough funding, but it was for such a very different reason than I think other projects. It wasn't that they were running out of funding from, exactly. They didn't over-design or hire too many people or decide to use expensive materials. It was literally the whole world was at a loss. And I really like that annual report piece that you had in there where they very diplomatically explain why they can't move forward. They're like the rest of the world, our company is feeling this too. So that was a very interesting piece. That one stood out to me.
Yeah, that was, it really did add a huge effect. And as you can imagine, from a company standpoint, at that point, you're not worried about spending, money to house all the people that are going to be coming to your park. At that point, to the extent you're going to spend money, you're going to spend it on attractions and things that try to convince people to actually come to the park, and fill the rooms that you do have available.
I think it's interesting that I think we all get caught in the Disney bubble a little bit. And we do, a lot of park goers talk about that, how you forget the outside world and its influence on the parks. I think this is a great example of how world events, government events do impact. Because you're right, if this OPEC hadn't happened, we would have different resorts, but maybe Epcot wouldn't have been fast-tracked or some other attractions, like you said, to try to get people to come to Florida and convince them that it's worth spending their money and their gasoline to travel. So, again, that one stood out to me for those reasons.
Yeah, and another situation like that were the September 11th attacks in 2001, and kind of the effect that had on people and travel, and people were just traveling a lot less, and you saw that with the Pop Century Resort that was under construction at the time. It was planned to be kind of have two sections, legendary years and classic years, and after the September 11th attacks, construction on the whole resort was stopped. But after the economy started picking up a little bit, Disney continued with half the project, which I think opened in 2003. But the other half just kind of sat, in a very un-Disney-like manner, kind of an abandoned state until, many years later when Art of Animation finally opened, in 2012. But again, that's an example of external things happening in the world that have a trickle-down effect on things like tourism and the amount of people who are going to Walt Disney World.
Yeah, that hotel is so fascinating to me because it's like, that's literally an abandoned idea. Like, you had a whole building constructed and just left it out in the open. Like, some stuff, as you say, it doesn't make it really past the drawing board, so to speak. But nope, that one was there.
Yeah, that was a pretty bad, because you would see pictures, people, there were certain rooms where you would have at Pop Century where you could literally see, this very un-Disney-like skeleton of a resort. And so you'd see all these pictures, Disney would use it, from time to time as a storage area. So you would see, a lot of crates and a lot of, pallets with different materials on it. And, and it's amazing to me that it took so long for them to actually do something with the land, and actually, a decade essentially to before they kind of reworked it and built the resort that is there today.
So we really enjoyed reading your book. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. But we want to know more about your other books. If readers love your book as much as we did, what else of yours can we be reading?
Yeah, so I've started a series called, The Backstories and Magical Secrets of Walt Disney World. And as of today, there are 2 volumes out that collectively cover the Magic Kingdom. And really the inspiration for those books was, I started thinking, what is it about Walt Disney World that people love so much, right? I mean, I say I'm a 42-year-old grown man. Why do I love this place so much? And so I started thinking about all the specific things that I like about Disney, where it's, the attractions and the cast members and the architecture of the buildings and the music and all this stuff. And what I realized was, for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, what really makes Walt Disney World different is that, it allows us to kind of step out of reality and into, these grand stories that Disney Imagineers tell for us in the different parks and the different lands. And so what I wanted to do is create, a resource and a fun resource, hopefully, where you could get all of these backstories and all these secrets and hidden details and, what do all these windows mean and what do these crates mean and what about these little items? Do they have significance? And, again, I'd seen kind of bits and pieces. It's kind of like the Walt Disney World that never was. I'd seen like small bits and pieces of information like this in other resources. But, I want it all, right? I mean, if I want to read about Liberty Square and I want to know everything there is to know story-wise, detail-wise, secret-wise in that land. Same thing with the Haunted Mansion, same thing for all these attractions. And so I set about doing that. And, the original plan was just to have 4 volumes, one for each park. But, the Magic Kingdom in particular, because of how long it has been there, because of how many attractions it has, I just had to split it into 2 volumes. And again, I've been very humbled and blessed that, again, that series has gotten a great amount of feedback as well. I currently have, because people always ask me, the people like me who love these details just can't get enough of them, right? So I'm always getting asked, when's the next one coming out in that series? What's going to be next? And I've actually started, and I'm making good progress on an Animal Kingdom volume. And that doesn't make sense time-wise, right? Because you would think I would hit Epcot next, but because both Epcot and the studios were in just such a state of flux and such a state of change, I wanted to wait until those parks got a little more settled. Animal Kingdom, with the Pandora expansion up and running, that park has got a pretty good foothold now, so I wanted to kind of hit that one next. But what I love about that series is, even for someone like me who has been to the parks countless times and has set about creating a quote unquote definitive resource with as many of these different fun details as possible, I still see new things every time I go to the parks, right? And I think that's what makes it so fun, is there's always something new to learn. And my hope is that with that series, I can help add some enjoyment to the experience for other people who may not notice these fun details and may not know these really cool backstories for the attraction. And then my other book that's out, which is actually, these first 3 books are standalone books. This is actually a kind of a travel guide that I now update yearly, and it's dedicated just to attractions, right? So I love attractions. I don't know if you all are familiar with Celebrations magazine that my friend Tim Foster runs. I write the attraction articles for those magazines, and I think the primary reason, or one of the primary reasons that people go to Disney, is to ride the rides. But every travel guide I saw out there, for the attractions, you'll get maybe a paragraph or 2 paragraphs worth of information, about each ride. And I was like, man, I want a lot more information on that. I want to know what the entire attraction experience is like. I want to know what the secrets are. I want to know what the best seat is. I want to know the best fast pass strategy. I want to know it all. And so I did that. And again, it's gotten a great response. And the 2020 version was just updated, a few months ago with some great park maps and illustrations from my buddy Rob Yao. And man, it's just been a lot of fun.
We are very familiar with Lovingly Recalled little Timmy Foster on WDW radio.
Yes,
So,
yes.
very cool that you write for him.
Yeah, he is a really fun guy, and we've been doing that for a long time. I do the attractions articles and then the secrets articles each month as well, and it's just a great publication, one I really enjoy being a part of.
We might have to talk about that and your other books at some point. But do you have any advice for aspiring authors in the meantime?
Yes, I would say my advice is writing is not easy. It's hard, but anyone can do it. And I truly believe that. You just need an idea and consistently work at that idea. For me, I've got a family, have a demanding job, and so for me, it was impossible to sit down. It still is today, unfortunately, to write for 8 hours a day. I just could not do it. And so, but I knew that if I made time every night or most nights to spend even just 30 minutes or an hour or whatever time I had to consistently put the work in, each of those steps get you closer to the end of that marathon. And I believe that just, you can do it. Don't give up. Just consistently work at it, and I can promise you that you'll get to the end. You'll get to the finish line.
Getting something on the paper is better than getting nothing on the paper, for sure. Our final question that we always ask our authors is: we love to add to our bookshelves. So, what is your favorite Disney book that we can add to ours?
That's difficult because as you can imagine, I have a lot of Disney books. But the ones that I would recommend for anyone, whether you're passionate about Disney books or the Disney parks, or you just want something fun to read, and it's a couple of books that a lot of people have. The first is Since the World Began, Walt Disney World: The First 25 Years by Jeff Curdy, and that is just a phenomenal book that is an easy read but gives a great historical account of the Disney parks over the first 25 years. And I've read that book, multiple times, and I've used it as a resource in many of the books that I've written. The other books are, the Imagineering Field Guide series. And, admittedly, those are difficult to read because they're so small. I wish the formatting was a little different. But those also inspired my Backstories series also, right? Because again, you got a lot of fun details in those books, and I decided, man, I want more of that, and so I kind of went out and did it myself. But lastly, and this is a new book, but the new Mark Davis, in his own words, 2-volume set is really just a masterpiece. And for someone like me, Mark Davis is my absolute favorite Imagineer. And again, those books are expensive, but for me, well worth the price, because it's just a treasure trove of good stories and art that you've never seen before. So any of those, I think, to the extent you don't have them, would be great additions.
Emily got the Mark Davis book for Christmas, and I got the book for Valentine's Day. So that will be coming soon this year, hopefully. I love that idea of a treasure trove of books, and that actually leads me well into what is upcoming for us. We always like to let our listeners know what our next episode is going to be. So no homework required this time. We don't have to read before our next episode, but we will be joined once again by Jim Corcus to talk about rare finds to add to your own book collection. So it sounds like some of the ones you mentioned would fit right in there as well.
Yeah, and I love Jim. Jim is fantastic, just phenomenal storyteller. Jim obviously also writes for Bob McLean at Theme Park Press, and man, I just love his work.
We're excited to have him back. But in the meantime, folks can keep up with us on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse, or email with comments or ideas to bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. You can follow me, Courtney, on Instagram at GreatGuthsby, or on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle at Emily_McD.
And Chris, where can we find you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at CSmithDisney, and I'm always posting some of these fun finds and detailed historical photos. So if that's the kind of thing you like, then I think I'm a good follow. And you can also kind of see what I'm working on and see more of my books at ChrisSmithBooks.com.
Perfect. And is that the best place to find your books as well to order?
Yes, you can, and obviously they're on Amazon as well. So if you just search Chris Smith Disney, you'll get kind of the full listing there as well.
Awesome. Well, we like to, close our episode out with a quote and have our guests do the honors. Would you like to go ahead?
Sure, and this is one that people have heard 1,000 times, and it's famous, but it's still one of my favorites, and kind of gives me kind of a little bit of pep in my step. And it's by Walt Disney. During the last few years, we've ventured into a lot of different fields. We've had the opportunity to meet and work with a lot of wonderful people. I only hope that we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse.
I think you are the first person to actually pick that as a quote, and it's such a classic. Thank you.
Very good.
All right, listeners, thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to having you join us again for our next episode. Until then, TTFN.
Bye. Book of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.